The room was quiet enough to hear the ring hit the marble floor before anyone realized what had just been said. Ethan Cole had just reached into his jacket, the velvet box still open in his hand, when two small voices cut clean through the soft hum of clinking glasses and low jazz. "You're our dad." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They landed heavy, precise, like something that had been waiting years to be spoken. For a second, no one moved. The skyline behind them stretched wide through the glass walls of the rooftop restaurant, Manhattan glowing in gold and steel, but inside, everything narrowed to that table. Ethan didn't look down right away. His hand stayed frozen midair, the ring catching the candlelight as it trembled slightly between his fingers. Across from him, Victoria Hale blinked once, then again, her smile still half-formed, confusion creeping in before the meaning did. Around them, a few heads turned, subtle at first, then sharper, curiosity rising like a ripple across the room. The two little girls stood side by side, no older than 5, their coats slightly oversized, their curls catching the light in soft halos. One of them held the other's hand, tight, like this moment mattered more than anything they had been told to fear. Ethan finally looked at them, really looked, and something in his expression shifted, not fully, not openly, but enough. The shape of their eyes, the tilt of their chins, familiar in a way that didn't belong to coincidence. He exhaled, slow, controlled, the kind of breath he used in boardrooms when numbers didn't add up. "I think you're mistaken," he said, his voice even, almost gentle, but there was an edge beneath it, something rehearsed, something defensive. The taller girl shook her head, small but certain. "Mom said you might say that." The sentence didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded remembered. Victoria's hand slowly lowered from the table, her fingers curling into her napkin as she turned toward Ethan, searching his face for something he wasn't offering. The room wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet anymore either. Phones shifted subtly on nearby tables, screens lighting up under the pretense of messages that weren't being read. Ethan straightened in his chair, placing the ring box down with deliberate care, as if the movement itself could restore order. "Where is your mother?" he asked. This time sharper, controlled authority slipping back into place. The girls didn't answer immediately. Instead, they both glanced over his shoulder. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. Just a small, shared movement, like they already knew she would be there. And when Ethan turned, he saw her. Amara Brooks stood near the edge of the dining floor, just beyond the glow of the nearest chandelier, her figure still, composed, almost detached from the chaos she had just set into motion. She wasn't dressed to impress the room. No glitter, no statement pieces, just a simple dark coat and quiet presence that somehow drew more attention than anything else in the space. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She didn't even step forward. Her eyes met his, steady, unshaken, like she had already lived through this moment long before he had. Ethan's throat tightened, just slightly, just enough to make his next breath feel heavier than it should. Victoria followed his gaze, her confusion sharpening into something else, something colder. "Ethan," she said softly, but there was tension in it now, a question wrapped in a warning. He didn't answer her. Not yet. Because for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole wasn't thinking about perception, or timing, or control. He was looking at a woman who had nothing to prove, 2 children who had nothing to hide, and a version of his life that didn't ask for permission before stepping into the light. No one told the room to be quiet, but it happened anyway, like the air itself had decided to listen. Ethan did not step toward her. He did not call her name. He just stood there, the distance between them stretching wider than the entire city behind the glass. Amara did not move either. She did not rush to explain, did not offer a single word to soften what had already been said. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the girls for a brief moment, her expression gentle but firm, then lifted it back to Ethan with the same calm that had unsettled him more than any accusation could. "Girls," she said softly, her voice steady, "come here." The 2 little girls hesitated, just for a second, their small hands still linked, their eyes flicking between Ethan and their mother as if trying to understand which version of the truth they were supposed to stand in. The shorter one, Naomi, took a small step back first, but the other, Lila, lingered, her eyes still fixed on Ethan with a quiet determination that did not belong to someone her age. "You said he would look at us," Lila said, her voice not loud, but clear enough to reach him. You said he would know. The sentence landed differently than the first. It was not a claim. It was a belief. Ethan's jaw tightened, not visibly enough for most, but Victoria saw it. She pushed her chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, a sound that felt too loud in the fragile stillness. Ethan, she said again, this time more firmly, standing now, her posture straight, controlled, but her eyes searching, calculating, trying to piece together something that refused to fit. Do you know her? The question was simple, but it carried weight, expectation, and the first crack of doubt. Ethan did not answer immediately. His gaze had shifted back to the girls, then past them, then finally settled again on Amara. There was a flicker of recognition now, faint but undeniable, like a memory pushing through a door he had locked years ago. We met, he said finally, his tone measured, careful, as if each word had to pass through a filter before being allowed out. It was not a lie, but it was not the truth either. Amara did not react to the answer. She did not challenge it. She did not correct him. Instead, she stepped forward just enough to close the distance to her daughters, placing a hand lightly on Naomi's shoulder. That is enough, she said, not to Ethan, but to the moment itself. We are leaving. It should have ended there. Clean, quiet, controlled. But Lila did not move. She looked up at her mother, then back at Ethan, her brows pulling together in a small, confused frown. But he did not say no, she whispered. The words were soft, but they cut through everything else. Ethan felt it, sharp and immediate. Because she was right. He had not said no. He had redirected, deflected, contained, but he had not denied it outright. And now the absence of that one word hung heavier than any accusation. Victoria turned fully toward him now, her composure still intact, but thinner, stretched. Ethan, she said, slower this time, each syllable. Deliberate, look at them. He did. Not because she told him to, but because he could not stop himself anymore. The longer he looked, the harder it became to separate instinct from fact. The way Naomi's fingers curled slightly inward when she was nervous. The way Lila held her chin, stubborn, unyielding. Small things. Specific things. Familiar things. The kind you do not notice unless they belong to you. Across the room, someone dropped a fork. Another person shifted their phone, angling it just enough to capture the scene without being obvious. The illusion of privacy had already disappeared. Ethan felt it slipping, the control he was known for, the narrative he had built, all of it beginning to fracture under something he had never accounted for. Not a competitor, not a scandal, something quieter, something undeniable. Amara watched him the entire time, not with anger, not with expectation, but with a stillness that suggested she had already accepted every possible outcome long before this night. We did not come for anything, she said finally, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough to reach him without inviting the room in. They just wanted to see you. That was it. No demand. No accusation. Just a truth placed gently between them. And somehow, that made it harder to breathe. The word hung between them long after she said it. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just present in a way that refused to be ignored. They just wanted to see you. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, subtle but disorienting, like a balance he had relied on had quietly tilted without warning. He had prepared for conflict, for accusation, for something he could respond to with logic or distance, but not this. Not a moment that asked nothing from him, and yet demanded everything at the same time. Victoria's eyes moved from Amara to the girls and back again, sharper now, more focused, as if she was no longer searching for an explanation but measuring the absence of one. You said you met her, she said slowly, her voice controlled but no longer soft. When Ethan did not look at her, his attention remained fixed on the two small figures standing just a few feet away, as if answering her would require him to break something he was not ready to touch yet. A few years ago, he replied, the words coming out flat, insufficient even to his own ears. Victoria let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. A few years ago, she repeated, her gaze dropping briefly to the girls, then lifting again with something colder behind it. And you did not think that was worth mentioning. It was not a question. Ethan finally turned to her, but whatever response he had been about to give stalled before it reached his lips, because at that moment Naomi shifted closer to Amara, her small hand reaching up to grip the fabric of her coat. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to break the stillness. "Did we do something wrong?" The question was not directed at Ethan, but it reached him anyway. It slipped past every defense he had built and landed somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, where things were not measured in statements or strategies. Amara immediately knelt down, bringing herself level with her daughter, her movements calm, deliberate, protective without urgency. "No," she said gently, brushing a curl away from Naomi's face. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Her voice carried warmth, certainty, a kind of quiet strength that did not ask permission to exist. Lila remained standing, though, her eyes still on Ethan, searching, not accusing, just trying to understand something that did not match the picture she had been given. "You said he was brave," she said, her tone softer now, less certain than before. "You said he would not be scared." The words were simple, but they cracked something open. Ethan inhaled sharply, the air suddenly feeling thinner, heavier, harder to hold. "Brave." The word echoed in a way that felt almost misplaced, like it belonged to someone he used to be, or someone he had convinced himself he still was. He had faced investors, competitors, entire rooms designed to challenge him. But this small, steady expectation in a child's voice, felt different. It was not about winning. It was about being seen. And he was not sure he knew how to do that anymore. Around them, the restaurant continued in fragments, low murmurs, subtle movements. But the center of it all remained fixed on that space between them. Ethan took a step forward before he realized he had made the decision to move. It was not dramatic, not rushed, just one step, but it shifted the entire weight of the moment. Victoria noticed immediately. Her posture stiffened, her expression tightening, not with anger, but with something more controlled, more final. "Ethan," she said, her voice lower now, quieter, but edged with something that did not invite negotiation. He paused, just for a second, caught between two versions of himself, one that had always chosen clarity, distance, control, and another that was being pulled, slowly but steadily, towards something he could not define yet. Amara rose to her feet again, her hand still resting lightly on Naomi's shoulder, her gaze steady as it met his. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She simply stood there, allowing him the space to choose what came next. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized that whatever he said now would not shape the situation. It would reveal him. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like something fragile being stretched to its limit, and Ethan felt it in the way every second seemed longer than the last. He stood there, one step closer than before, but still not close enough to cross whatever line had been drawn without words. His eyes moved from Lila to Naomi, then back to Amara, searching for something that could anchor him, something familiar he could hold on to. But nothing about this moment belonged to the version of his life he understood. "I am not scared," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the polished confidence that usually defined it, replaced with something quieter, something less certain. The words were not loud, but they carried. Lila tilted her head slightly, studying him, not with defiance, but with a kind of careful attention that felt too mature for her age. "Then why did you not say yes?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it. Only logic, simple and direct, the kind that did not bend to comfort or convenience. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped, because there was no answer that would not expose something he had spent years avoiding. Victoria exhaled sharply beside him, the sound controlled but edged with disbelief. "This is not happening," she said under her breath, more to herself than anyone else, but the tension in her voice pulled the moment tighter. She stepped forward now, positioning herself slightly closer to Ethan, her presence no longer just observant, but assertive. "You need to explain what this is," she said, her tone measured, but firm, her eyes locking onto Amara with a precision that made the air feel colder. Amara met her gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, almost distant. "There is nothing to explain tonight," she replied, her voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, just clear. "The girls wanted to see him. They have." Victoria's lips pressed together, the restraint in her posture tightening. "That is not how this works," she said, her voice dropping slightly, controlled but sharper now. You do not just walk into someone's life like this, and she stopped herself, the sentence cutting off as if she had realized too late that the moment was no longer hers to define. Amara did not interrupt her. She did not react to the edge in her tone. Instead, she looked back at Ethan, her gaze steady, waiting, not for permission, not for approval, but for something else entirely. Something he had not yet given. Naomi shifted again, her small fingers tightening around her mother's coat. "Mom," she whispered, her voice softer now, uncertain. "Can we go home?" The word home landed gently, but it carried weight, a quiet reminder that for them, this moment was not about spectacle or questions or control. It was about something much simpler, something real. Amara nodded immediately, her hand brushing lightly over Naomi's hair. "Yes," she said, her tone warm, decisive. "We are going." Lila hesitated for a fraction longer, her eyes still fixed on Ethan, searching for something that had not arrived. Then slowly, she stepped back, her small hand reaching for her sister's, their fingers linking again in the same quiet way they had when they first walked in. Ethan watched the movement, something tightening in his chest as the distance began to re-establish itself. Not forced, not dramatic, just inevitable. He had one moment left. One space where something could be said, something that might change the direction of what was already slipping away. "Wait," he said, the word coming out before he had fully decided to speak it. It was not loud, but it stopped them. Amara paused, her hand resting on the girl's shoulders, but she did not turn immediately. The pause itself felt intentional, like she was allowing him the space to hear his own voice before choosing whether it mattered. When she finally looked back, her expression had not changed, but there was something deeper in her eyes now, something that suggested she had already heard every version of what he might say. Ethan took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel real, unavoidable. His gaze dropped briefly to the girls, then lifted again to meet hers. "How old are they?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, shifted everything. Because it was no longer a denial. It was no longer distance. It was the first step towards something he could not take back. Amara did not answer right away, and in that pause, the entire room seemed to lean closer without moving, as if even the air was waiting to hear what she would say. Ethan held her gaze, steady now, but there was something different in it, something that had shifted the moment he asked the question. It was no longer about control. It was about consequence. "5," Amara said finally, her voice calm, unhurried, the number landing softly but carrying more weight than anything that had been said before. Ethan's brow tightened slightly, the calculation immediate, instinctive. 5 years. His mind moved faster than his expression, pulling timelines apart, reconstructing moments he had buried under decisions he once believed were necessary. 5 years ago, he had been in Chicago for a series of back-to-back acquisitions, long nights, short mornings, a version of his life where everything was measured in outcomes and efficiency. And somewhere in that blur, there had been a night that did not fit the pattern, a conversation that lingered longer than it should have, a connection he had categorized as temporary, contained, finished, except it had not been. 5, he repeated under his breath, not questioning it, but trying to place it, to align it with a past that suddenly felt incomplete. Lila shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around Naomi's hand as she looked up at him again, her voice quieter now, but no less steady. "We had a birthday last month," she said, as if offering him something he had missed, something small but important. "Mom made cupcakes." The detail was simple, almost ordinary, but it carried a kind of intimacy that did not belong in this space, not under these lights, not in front of people who were pretending not to. "Listen," Ethan swallowed, his throat tightening in a way he could not fully control. "Cupcakes. 5 candles. A moment that had existed without him. Complete. Real. Untouched by anything he had built or decided." Victoria let out a slow breath beside him, her composure still intact, but thinner now, stretched to a point where even the smallest shift could break it. "Ethan," she said, her voice lower, more controlled than before, but no longer steady. "You need to tell me what this is." He did not look at her, not because he was avoiding her, but because he could not yet divide his attention without losing hold of what was unfolding in front of him. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out quieter than expected, stripped of certainty, carrying something closer to truth than anything he had said before. Amara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, not in response to his words, but to the tone beneath them. "I know," she replied, and there was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just acknowledgement. That was what made it heavier, because she was not trying to prove anything. She was simply stating what had always been. Naomi looked up at her mother, then back at Ethan, her small voice hesitant. "You did not come because you did not know?" she asked, her question fragile, but clear. Ethan felt it again, that quiet, direct impact that bypassed every defense he had ever built. He nodded, slowly, not as a strategy, not as a response, but because it was the only answer that existed. "No," he said, his voice steadying slightly. "I did not know." Lila studied him for a moment longer, then glanced at her sister, her grip softening just a little. The tension between them shifted, not resolved, but different, not as sharp, not as uncertain. Around them, the restaurant continued to exist, but it felt distant now, like a backdrop that had lost its relevance. Ethan's focus remained fixed, his mind no longer racing ahead, but settling into the present in a way he had not allowed in years. 5 years. 2 children. A life that had unfolded without him. Not hidden, not manipulated, just lived. Amara adjusted Naomi's coat slightly, her movements gentle, habitual, the kind that came from repetition, from years of doing something alone without expecting anyone else to step in. She looked back at Ethan, her gaze steady, grounded. "We are not here to change your life," she said, her voice calm, clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "We already built ours." The words settled between them, not as a challenge, but as a boundary. And for the first time that night, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming something he had lost. It would be about earning something he had never been part of. The boundary she set did not feel loud, but it was absolute, and Ethan felt it settle into the space between them with a clarity he could not ignore. He had spent years moving through rooms where everything could be negotiated, adjusted, rewritten, but this was not one of those moments. This was something fixed, something that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. His eyes moved again to the girls, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he was allowing himself to actually see them instead of searching for ways to explain them. Naomi leaned slightly into Amara's side, her small fingers still curled into the fabric of her coat, while Lila stood a little straighter, her gaze steady, watching him with a quiet expectation that had not fully disappeared. It was not hope exactly, but it was not indifference either. It was something in between, something that had not yet decided what it would become. "What are their names?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, the question simple but carrying a different weight than the last. He was no longer asking to understand the situation. He was asking to understand them. Amara studied him for a brief moment before answering, as if measuring the intention behind the words rather than the words themselves. "Lila," she said, nodding slightly toward the older girl, "and Naomi." The names settled into him more deeply than he expected. Lila, Naomi. Not abstract anymore. Not distant. Specific. Real. Lila lifted her chin just a fraction, acknowledging the moment without stepping forward, while Naomi gave a small, almost shy glance in his direction before looking back at her mother. Ethan repeated the names quietly, not for anyone else to hear, but as if saying them was a way to hold on to something that was already slipping into meaning. Lila. Naomi. Victoria turned her head sharply at that, the shift immediate, her composure tightening again, as she watched him engage in a way she had not expected. "Ethan," she said, her voice controlled, but no longer patient. "This is not a conversation you continue in the middle of a restaurant." Her words were reasonable, structured, the kind of response that fit the world he was used to, but they felt distant now, like instructions from a place he was no longer standing in. He glanced at her briefly, just enough to acknowledge her presence, but not enough to anchor himself back to it. "I know," he said, but he did not step away. Amara noticed that. She noticed everything. The shift in his tone, the way his focus had narrowed, the fact that for the first time, he was not trying to end the moment. She adjusted her stance slightly, grounding herself, her hand still resting lightly on Naomi's shoulder, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharper now. "We are leaving," she repeated, not as a reminder, but as a decision already made. This is not where this belongs. Lila glanced up at her, then back at Ethan, her voice softer now, almost careful. Will we see you again? The question was different from the ones before. It was not about the past. It was about what came next. Ethan felt it immediately, the weight of it, the simplicity of it, the way it cut through everything else that had complicated the moment. He did not answer right away. Not because he did not want to, but because for the first time, he understood that whatever he said would not just fill the silence. It would shape something real. He looked at Amara, not for permission, but for context, for understanding, for anything that could guide him through a space he had never navigated before. She held his gaze, steady, unreadable, but not closed. She was not giving him the answer. She was giving him the responsibility of it. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured, deliberate, as if he was choosing his words with a care he had never needed before. If you want to, he said finally, his voice low, honest in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. Then yes. Lila studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not fully convinced, but not dismissing it either. Naomi's grip on her mother's coat loosened just slightly, her shoulders relaxing, in a way that suggested something had shifted, even if it was small. Amara watched the exchange without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting something quieter, something deeper, not relief, not satisfaction, but acknowledgement. She gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, then turned her attention back to the girls. Come on, she said gently. It is time. And this time, they moved. Slowly, together, their steps light but certain, their presence beginning to pull away from the center of the room. Ethan did not follow. Not yet. He stood where he was, watching them go, the distance growing again, but no longer empty. Because now it carried something else. Something that had not been there before. A beginning he had not chosen, but one he could no longer ignore. The door did not close loudly behind them, but the shift it created was immediate, like a thread pulled loose from the fabric of the room, leaving everything slightly off balance. Ethan remained where he stood, his eyes fixed on the path they had taken, the space they had occupied now empty, but still carrying their presence in a way that refused to fade. The low murmur of the restaurant began to return, cautious at first, then steadier, as if the world was attempting to resume something that no longer fit the same way. A server passed by with a tray, the faint clink of glass against glass sounding sharper than it should have, grounding the moment in reality again. But Ethan did not move. Not until the elevator doors at the far end slid shut with a soft, final chime. Only then did he exhale, slow and controlled, though it did nothing to ease the weight that had settled into his chest. You were just going to stand there? Victoria's voice cut through, composed but strained, pulling him back into the version of the night that had existed before everything shifted. He turned to her, finally, fully, taking in the way her posture had changed, still upright, still polished, but no longer effortless. There was tension in her shoulders now, something guarded behind her eyes that had not been there before. We need to talk, she continued, her tone firm, leaving no room for delay. Ethan nodded once, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement, then reached down and closed the velvet ring box with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. He placed it back into his jacket without looking at it, the gesture automatic, detached, like something that belonged to a different version of him entirely. They sat again, but the table felt different now, smaller somehow, the space between them filled with something neither of them had addressed yet. Victoria folded her hands in front of her, her fingers interlacing tightly, a controlled motion that revealed more than she intended. 5 years, she said quietly, her eyes locked onto his. You were telling me that 5 years ago you met a woman, and now she shows up with 2 children who look at you like that, and you did not know. Ethan held her gaze, steady but no longer defensive. I did not know, he repeated, and this time there was no attempt to shape the words into something more acceptable. It was simply the truth, incomplete as it was. Victoria studied him, searching for something that would contradict him, something she could challenge, but she found nothing. That did not make it easier. It made it worse. And now, she asked, her voice lower, sharper in its quietness. What does that mean now? The question hung between them, not urgent, but unavoidable. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, his fingers tapping once, then stilling as he forced himself to stop moving, to stay present in a way he was not used to. "It means," he began, then paused, the words not coming as easily as they usually did. Because this was not a negotiation. There was no strategy to rely on. "It means I have something to understand," he said finally, his tone measured, but grounded in something real. Victoria's expression tightened, not with anger, but with clarity, as if the shape of the situation had finally settled into something she could see, even if she did not accept it. "Understand," she repeated, her voice almost hollow, as if the word itself was not enough. "That is what you call this?" Ethan did not respond immediately. His mind had already shifted, not back to the table, not to the conversation in front of him, but to the image of two small hands linked together, to a voice asking if they would see him again, to a number that had rearranged his past in a way he could not undo. 5 years. Lila. Naomi. Names that now carried weight he had not chosen, but could not dismiss. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice steadier now, but colder. "I need to know where I stand in this," she said, her words precise, controlled, each one placed carefully. Ethan met her gaze, and for a moment, the silence stretched again, not empty, but full of everything that had not been decided yet. He could see the expectation in her eyes, the need for certainty, for a clear line that would define what this meant for them. But for the first time, he did not have one to offer. "I do not know yet," he said, and the honesty of it settled heavier than anything else he could have said. Victoria leaned back slowly, the movement deliberate, her expression closing off in a way that felt final, not dramatic, not loud, just certain. "Then you figure it out," she replied, her tone calm, but distant now. "Because this is not something you leave unfinished." Ethan nodded once, but his focus had already shifted again, not to the table, not to the ring in his pocket, but to the elevator doors at the far end of the room, as if he could still see them standing there, waiting, asking a question he had only just begun to answer. The elevator doors had already closed, but Ethan could still see them in his mind, the way Lila had looked back one last time, not waiting, not hoping, just acknowledging, like she had already learned not to expect more than what was given. That image stayed with him long after the table fell quiet again, long after the server returned to clear untouched plates and refill glasses that no one reached for. Victoria did not speak immediately, and for once, neither did he. The city outside continued to move, headlights tracing steady lines through the streets below, a rhythm that had always grounded him, always reminded him that everything could keep going no matter what shifted inside a single room. But tonight, that rhythm felt distant, almost irrelevant. Ethan reached for his phone, not out of habit, but with purpose, his thumb hovering over the screen for a brief second before unlocking it. Victoria noticed the movement instantly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice controlled, but sharper now, the patience thinning into something more direct. Ethan did not look up right away. He scrolled once, then stopped, as if realizing that whatever he was searching for would not be found in a list or a contact name. "I need to find her," he said simply, his tone even, but anchored in a decision that had already been made. Victoria let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. "Find her," she repeated, the words landing flat, stripped of any warmth. "You do not even know where she lives." Ethan lifted his gaze to meet hers, steady now, no hesitation left in it. "I will," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was no longer a question of possibility, but of intent. Victoria leaned back slowly, her posture composed, but the distance between them more defined than it had ever been. "So that is it," she said, her voice quieter now, but colder. "That is what tonight becomes." Ethan did not respond immediately. He placed his phone down on the table, his fingers resting against it for a moment, as if grounding himself in the decision he had just voiced. "It was always going to become something," he said finally, his tone measured, not defensive, just honest. "I just did not know what." Victoria studied him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else in the room, but enough for him to feel it. "You were going to propose tonight," she said, her voice steady, each word deliberate. It was not a question. Ethan glanced briefly at his jacket, at the place where the ring now sat hidden again, then back at her. I know, he said, and there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to reframe it into something less stark. Victoria nodded once, a small, controlled motion, as if confirming something to herself rather than reacting to him. And now you are thinking about them, she continued, her gaze unwavering. 2 children you met for less than 5 minutes. Ethan inhaled slowly, the breath steady, deliberate, as if he was choosing not to rush through something that deserved more weight than a quick answer. I am thinking about what I did not know, he said, his voice low, grounded. And what that means. Victoria's lips pressed together, the tension in her expression tightening just slightly. It means you made a mistake, she said, her tone firm, clear, offering him a version of the situation that fit within the world they had built together. And now you decide how to handle it. Ethan held her gaze, but something in him resisted the simplicity of that explanation. Because this did not feel like a mistake. It felt like something that had existed long before he chose to ignore it. It is not just something to handle, he said quietly. It is something that is already there. The distinction settled between them, subtle but significant, and Victoria felt it. Her posture straightened, her expression sharpening into something more resolved. Then you need to decide what matters more, she said, her voice calm, but firm, no room left for uncertainty. Because you cannot stand in both places at once. Ethan did not answer. Not because he did not understand the question, but because for the first time, the answer was not immediate. His mind moved again, not to boardrooms or contracts or outcomes, but to a small voice asking if they would see him again, to a quiet assurance that they had built a life without him, to a number that had already reshaped everything he thought he knew. 5 years. Lila. Naomi. The weight of it did not feel like pressure. It felt like gravity. Victoria watched him in silence. And in that silence, she understood more than anything he could have said. She reached for her glass, lifted it slightly, then set it back down without taking a sip, the motion precise, controlled, final in its restraint. You should go, she said softly, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the calm in her expression, the distance that had settled there, not out of anger, but out of clarity. He nodded once, slow, acknowledging what she had just given him, space, but also a line he would not be able to step back across unchanged. He stood, the movement deliberate, and for a brief moment, his hand brushed against his jacket, against the ring he had not given, against a future that had been certain just an hour ago. Then he turned, his gaze already shifting toward the exit, toward the place where the elevator had closed, toward something that had already begun whether he was ready or not. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Each floor passing in quiet increments marked only by the soft hum of machinery and the faint reflection of Ethan's own face staring back at him from the mirrored walls. He barely recognized the expression there, not because it had changed dramatically, but because it lacked something he had always relied on, certainty. When the doors opened to the lobby, the noise of the city filtered in through the glass entrance, distant traffic, a siren somewhere far off, the low rhythm of a world that had no idea anything had shifted. But for him, everything had. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the temperature dropping just enough to make his breath visible for a second before it disappeared. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment, he stood still, scanning the sidewalk as if he expected them to still be there, waiting. They were not. Of course they were not. Amara had never been someone who waited for him. He exhaled slowly, then reached for his phone again, this time with a clearer intention. His thumb moved across the screen, pulling up contacts, messages, names tied to cities and deals and meetings, but none of them led to her. Not directly. He paused, thinking, reconstructing, pulling at the one thread he still had. Chicago. 5 years ago. A conference hotel on Michigan Avenue. Late summer. A conversation that had not fit the pattern of everything else. He remembered her then, not in fragments, but in a clarity that surprised him. The way she had listened without trying to impress, the way she had spoken without asking for permission, the way she had walked away without leaving anything behind to follow. At the time, he had respected that. Now he understood it differently. He scrolled again, then stopped, selecting a name. Marcus. His assistant answered on the second ring. Good evening, sir. Ethan did not waste time. I need you to find someone, he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that made Marcus pause on the other end. Amara Brooks. She was in Chicago about 5 years ago. I need an address. There was a brief silence, the kind that usually came before a question, but Marcus did not ask one. I will start now, he replied, professional as always, but with a note of curiosity he did not voice. I will call you as soon as I have something. Ethan ended the call and lowered the phone, the screen dimming as it slipped back into his hand. For the first time that night, he was not reacting. He was moving forward. A black car pulled up along the curb, the driver stepping out slightly, recognizing him, ready to open the door, but Ethan did not move toward it. Not yet. Instead, he looked down the street again, at the direction they had taken, at the path he had missed by minutes. Somewhere in that city, 2 small girls were probably asking questions, not about money or status or anything that defined his world, but about something much simpler. Whether he would come back, whether he meant what he said, whether he would choose to be there. The weight of that settled into him, not as pressure, but as something steadier, something that did not demand immediate answers, but would not accept being ignored. His phone vibrated in his hand, the screen lighting up with Marcus's name sooner than expected. Ethan answered immediately. Sir, Marcus said, his voice precise, but slightly faster than usual. I have an address. Brooklyn. I am sending it to you now. The message came through a second later, the location clear, specific, real. Ethan looked at it, memorizing it in an instant, then lifted his gaze again, this time not scanning, not searching, but focusing. He stepped toward the car, the driver opening the door without a word, and this time, he did not hesitate. As he slid into the back seat, the city lights reflecting off the window beside him, he felt the shift fully settle into place. Not a disruption, not a mistake, something else. Something that had been waiting quietly for 5 years, not demanding attention, not forcing itself into his life, just existing until the moment it could no longer be ignored. Brooklyn, he said, his voice calm, certain now in a way that felt different from before, less about control, more about direction. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic, the restaurant disappearing behind him, along with the version of the night he had planned. Ahead of him, the street stretched, out in lines of light and shadow, leading toward a place he had never been, toward a life that had already begun without him, toward 2 names that no longer felt distant. Lila, Naomi. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether they were his. It was whether he was ready to become someone they could recognize,